Hi everyone, my name's Maya. I'm the Head of Humanitarian Policy and Campaigns at Oxfam. This is my first time at ALNAP, so I'm really excited to be here and really excited to talk to you about Oxfam's campaign on Yemen, and in particular our challenge to the US and to the UK around their arms sales to Saudi Arabia for use in the war in Yemen. So as most of you know, in March 2015, the conflict in Yemen escalated when a Saudi-led military coalition intervened after the Houthi rebel movement ousted the country's president. The conflict has been deadly and it's been brutal. Airstrikes using British and American-made bombs have hit schools, homes, mosques, and families sleeping in their homes at night. The ground fighting has also been indiscriminate. And Yemen, already the poorest country in the Middle East, is now on the brink of famine. During that time, the UK government alone approved arms sales to the Saudis to the tune of £3.3 billion. Oxfam's campaign has aimed to highlight this catastrophic humanitarian crisis. We've called on all sides to uphold the laws of war. We've pushed for a ceasefire, and we've also sought to give a platform and give a voice to Yemeni civil society as they call for peace. But perhaps the most controversial part of our campaign has been around the arms sales to the Saudis, and that's what I'm going to focus on here today. We've helped move Yemen from being a fringe concern to a political and a humanitarian issue that cannot be ignored. And the way in which we did this has lessons for all of us who believe in change. When we first started campaigning on Yemen back in March 2015, I knew it was going to be an uphill struggle. Yemen wasn't just a forgotten crisis. As one of my media colleagues said to me at the time, a crisis has to be known first before it can be forgotten. And our polling in the UK showed that essentially it wasn't possible to poll on Yemen because people didn't understand the question. They didn't even know where Yemen was, let alone that there was a terrible war there. And of course, the very, very brutal conflict in Syria and the refugee flows were dominating the media landscape. There just wasn't room for another Middle Eastern conflict. And we also knew that in challenging these vast and lucrative arms sales, we would be going up against entrenched geopolitical and business interests. But a small group of us felt that we had to go for it, and there were three main reasons. The first one was precisely because governments that we had at least a degree of influence over were so complicit in the crisis. This gave us an exceptional opportunity to reduce the suffering in Yemen. Secondly, Oxfam had been in Yemen for 30 years. We had a large presence on the ground, and we were one of the first to scale up. And thirdly, we'd been campaigning for 10 years for an international arms trade treaty, which is now in place and which is supposed to stop such irresponsible arms transfers. So we had on our side legitimacy through our on-the-ground programme and a clear moral call. We had a call that stirred passions and was easy to understand. Most people can get the connection between arms sales and human suffering. But calling out the Saudis and their backers posed particular risks to our programmes and to our colleagues on the coalface. And there were also funding considerations. And I was involved in many, many difficult conversations as to whether Oxfam could really afford to take on this level of risk. We did so in the end because even those reticent colleagues were persuaded by both the moral but also the pragmatic argument that the only way that we could actually get much needed attention to the humanitarian crisis in Yemen was by focusing on the scandal of the political scandal of the arms sales. We also had leadership from the top, with our CEO, Mark Goldring, quickly getting behind the campaign and giving us the confidence and the authority to really go for it. I should say this hasn't been a linear, straightforward process. We've had to dial the campaign up and down, depending on the risks to our programs. But what we have had is trust between a core group of campaigners, media, and program people who've been driving the campaign forward. We've always had a clear goal and a clear sense of mission, and it's meant that our planning meetings have been focused on action and opportunities, and we haven't spent lots of time in introspective, energy-sapping strategy sessions. We've had the space to be creative, to be bold, and to be responsive. So as Oxfam, we decided to go for it, but now we had to convince the rest of the world to listen. We had our first breakthrough when, after months and months of painstaking work, Oxfam facilitated a visit of BBC's Newsnight to Yemen back in September 2015. And over the year that's followed, a lot of the main broadcasters have gone into the country, so the BBC and Channel 4, and ultimately that set the stage for the DEC appeal that launched last December. We've spoken a bit today about images and emotions, and I've always been a big believer in the power of the visual and of human stories to really stir people into action and to tap into people's values. And I just want to give one example of that. So before the Newsnight piece aired, I had a run-in with one of my colleagues in the campaign department who said to me, look, there's just no point in investing heavily in public campaigning in Yemen because we're never going to get cut through. We sparred, we had a bit of an argument, I threw facts at him and I threw argument at him and I did what Duncan said we shouldn't do. I shouted and exhorted and he wouldn't budge and I left the meeting feeling really frustrated. The next night, that Newsnight piece aired on TV and he texted me the minute it had finished and he said, this is the most powerful piece of journalism we've ever facilitated. We have to get this story to a much wider audience. And I think that just showed for me that sometimes it's only the visual, it's only the human story that's going to move people there in their heart and not up there. So we had the media coverage and we also had excellent reporting from MSF, from Amnesty, from Human Rights Watch, documenting what was happening in Yemen. But as we all know in this room, evidence and awareness is not necessarily sufficient to bring about change. And that's particularly the case when you're going up against vested interests. So as part of this campaign, we've worked really hard to cultivate allies on the inside, in the UK Parliament, in the US Congress. We've used unusual methods and we've got unusual suspects to speak out. So where are we today, fast forward 2 years on? Well, against all the odds, shortly before leaving office, the Obama administration said that it would suspend a major arms deal to the Saudis. In the UK, Yemen has gone from being a concern of a handful of MPs to a mainstream political issue that's facing rigorous parliamentary scrutiny. Parliament, via a cross-party committee, has actually recommended that the government suspends arms sales pending an investigation, and the UK government faces a judicial review. Journalists and broadcasters who told me that they just couldn't run the story, they didn't have space, are now routinely reporting on Yemen. And we had a DEC appeal that raised 17 million from the UK public for a crisis that hitherto wasn't known at all. This has been a huge change, and perhaps it's easy to take it for granted and say, of course a crisis of this scale should be covered by the media, and of course those governments that are fueling that crisis should have their feet held to the fire. But honestly, when we started out on this, we really didn't believe that was going to be possible because of what we were up against. So I just want to recap some of the ingredients that made this change possible. It was moral clarity. It was the legitimacy from our on-the-ground presence. And by the way, I don't think we should be apologetic about being operational. It was the fact that we had leadership from the top and also trust between a core group driving change. We had the space to be creative and responsive. It was the power of the image and the power of the human story. And it was unusual allies, inside allies, and unusual suspects, unusual methods. But of course, there's absolutely no room here to feel or to be triumphant. The ALNAP organisers wanted me to end this talk on a point of resolution with a clear victory. And I wish I could oblige, but of course I cannot. The Trump administration has already said that they're going to rescind that suspension of arms sales. The UK arms sales continue and the government is digging in its heels. But most importantly and most tragically, the people of Yemen continue to suffer, and that suffering deepens. This type of change is always going to involve 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Perseverance is the name of the game. It's a long, hard fight, and that fight for Yemen and that fight for the international norms that all of us hold so dear in this room has never been more important. Thank you.
Neuroscience research shows that violence and neglect scar the growing brain. The adversity and trauma experienced during wars and emergencies affect children's memory and their ability to reason, to solve problems, and to express themselves creatively and emotionally. In other words, it affects their ability to learn.
After such fantastic stories in 5, I don't know how to follow, but I'm going to try to tell you about a change process that our Humanitarian Performance Monitoring, which we lovingly call HPM, has gone through due to a health emergency, specifically the Ebola health emergency.